G'day, my name is Nick, and in today's diorama I found this really cool 3D model online of this Wendigo or some sort of spirit forest or creature that I want to create this scene where a hunter or a hiker comes across this creature and has to sort of fight for his life. To get started on the Wendigo model, I'll first just give it a base coat in some blacks and browns. I can then give it an undertone of sort of this fleshy colour. I want to sort of have the area around his chest sort of look a bit more human and grotesque, and sort of as it goes out to his extremities, like his hands and his legs, sort of become more black and feral and creature-like. I'd heard of a Wendigo before, but I didn't really know much about the actual story of the creature. So I did a little research and learnt that it's a creepy monster from Native American folklore, specifically the tribes around the northern parts of America, so places like Nova Scotia. These stories describe the Wendigo as a kind of a monstrous spirit that looks part human, but in a really unsettling way. It's usually super skinny with long fangs and a freakishly long tongue. The origin story of the creature is pretty dark as well. Supposedly a Wendigo is created when someone turns to cannibalism, usually because they're starving during a brutal winter. The idea is that eating human flesh transforms you into a monster. It's a pretty intense way of warning people about the dangers of the harsh wilderness survival up north. Speaking of that long tongue, this model has two of those creepy suckers hanging out of its bony jaw. With those painted, the model is pretty much done. With the Wendigo all painted, I can start work on the base. The scene for this diorama was partially inspired by a video that Boily Hobby Time did here on YouTube a few years ago. When I saw the Wendigo model online, I really wanted to make my own version of this diorama. To create the shapes of the base, I'll first just build up a few different layers of XPF foam. I'll then grab my little vake that I've attached a little bit of wire to, and I can just start shaping those bits of foam down, just taking off the harsh edges and creating a more organic, natural look to the base. Most of the foam will be covered over in the next step using some sculptor mold, but this just sort of creates a more natural looking base layer for the diorama rather than sort of having those harsh, unnatural edges that the foam is sort of cut with. To create some rocks, I'm actually going to mix up some plaster and some grout and then pour those into some rock molds that I have. This plaster will then harden over the next couple hours and turn into these really cool rocks that sort of really create this natural look and, aren't as heavy and cumbersome as, using real rocks in a diorama. With the rocks all cured and popped out of the molds, I can grab my sculptor mold and add a little bit of water into that and then apply that across the whole base of the diorama. This will just create a really uneven sort of ground layer for the diorama and create a layer sort of that I can stick those rocks into that we just created previously. After the sculptor mold is all pressed onto the foam, I can smooth it down with a bit of water and then start getting those rocks stuck into it. With all the plaster molds pressed into the sculptor mold and smoothed in, I can start applying some gravel and dirt onto the diorama. I'll achieve this by first applying down a layer of PVA glue and then sprinkling down some rock ballast. I'll then come over the top of that with some more uneven rocks and pebbles of varying sizes, starting with larger pebbles and then working my way down to finer and finer grits, eventually coating the whole thing in a fine layer of dirt. I'll secure that all down with a heavy coat of watered down PVA glue. When the PVA glue is all dry, I'll give the whole thing a base coat in black. I can then paint back in the plaster rocks using some grey. To give them a bit more of a weathered look, I'll dry brush some lighter highlights onto the peaks of the rocks. I'll then continue the dry brushing across the rest of the diorama. starting with some dark browns and moving my way up to more lighter and lighter highlights, picking up just the top details of all the fine pebbles and dirt we glued on previously. To add just a little bit more depth and life to this initial layer of paint, I'll grab this green oil wash and just randomly add it across certain areas of the diorama, where I feel like moss and mold would be growing. To begin layering up some of the vegetation across the diorama, I'll start with these two little branches that I think really look like fallen logs. I'll add some moss growing all over them using some fine flocking. I went to my local botanic gardens recently and collected up some dried up conifer leaves. These will be really great for adding some natural leaf litter and some textures on the ground. I'll grit these up using my fingers so they fall down to mimic the way that leaves gather around pine trees in nature. The natural leaves are quite large, so to fill in the gaps between them, I've got this store-bought sort of hobby wood chip material, which I'll just sprinkle in to fill in all the gaps between the leaf litter. Then, just like the logs previously, I'll sprinkle down some of that green flocking across the base. I'll now glue down both of the logs we created previously onto the shoreline of the lake. Now I'll add a little bit of grass along the edge of the forest using my static grass applicator. I'll load up the canister with some 6mm grass. The applicator charges the little hairs with static electricity, which makes them stick up in the air when they land in the glue. Once the static grass is all cleaned up, I have these little laser cut ferns, which I think will really fit into the North American theme of this diorama. I'll pull these from their housing sheets and then fold them and bend them into the curved shapes that ferns have in nature. I'll now glue these ferns down into the forested area of the diorama. I'll now continue to add an assortment of different preserved plants and grass tufts that I have across different areas of the base. This will then just continue to build up the different layers of vegetation across the foresty area. If you're enjoying the video so far, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on any future builds, and it sort of helps as well to push it out to new users. So yeah, thanks. I wanted to add a few reeds sticking out of the lake. To create these, I'm going to grab these long wispy grass strands. I'll grab a little bunch of them and then cut them in half. The straight end I can now dip into some UV cure resin. I'll then cure the bottom of the grass and then attach them to the lake section of the diorama using some more UV cure resin. I'm going to try something a little bit new that I haven't done before, and I'm going to see how it turns out, which is creating some pine trees using some real materials like some asparagus fern and some branches that I found outside. I was walking my dog a couple weeks ago and found these little branches on the side of the road that were dried out and sticking out. I collected a whole bunch of them because I thought they could make a really ideal trunk for a pine tree. I cleaned up the bases of the trunks and then stuck a length of wooden skewer into the center of the sticks. This skewer will act as sort of like a support rod from when I sculpt the rest of the tree in the next step. To craft the upper reaches of the tree, I'll mix up some milliput and then sculpt that onto the lower trunk and skewer. By turning the trunk between my hands, I can create a tapering shape as the trunk reaches up to the point at the top of the tree. Next, to create some woodbark textures in the milliput, I'll grab some metal sculpting tools and scrape up and down in the milliput and try and line up with the natural wood grain textures in the branches that I collected. After the milliput is all cured, I'll give them a coat of paint. To create the branches and pine needles on the trees, I have this asparagus fern, which is actually an invasive weed here in Australia. It's growing in my backyard. So to not only get rid of this weed, but I can actually use the leaves to create what I'm hoping is a more natural looking pine tree. I will preserve the fern leaves by mixing up some glycerin, water, and green fabric dye. By soaking the leaves in this mixture for a couple of days, the glycerin will replace the water inside the leaves and should make them last for years to come in the diorama. To secure the preserved fern leaves onto the tree, I'll first drill a few holes up the trunk of the pine. I can then glue in the branches into these holes. With both pine trees now finished, I can stick them down into the foam base of the diorama. With all the vegetation on the base now done, we can move on to getting some resin into the lake section of the build. I'll be using Let's Resin's deep pour epoxy. Let's Resin literally has every kind of epoxy resin or UV cure resin that you could need for your project, so check out my Amazon link in the description. After I've coloured the resin with some alcohol inks, there's a lot of bubbles stirred into the resin, so I'll need to suck those out using my vacuum chamber. I found if I don't suck out these bubbles, some of them do tend to stick onto the side of the mould and make it look a little bit bubbly and not as clear as I would like. I'll then chuck the whole diorama into my chest freezer and pour in the epoxy resin. Now, I made a mistake here, which literally could have almost ruined the whole diorama, but luckily overnight the resin didn't completely cure and I sort of realized my issue. As you can probably tell, I didn't actually put the Wendigo into the resin before I poured it, so it literally could have cured without the resin, but luckily in the morning it was still a little bit soft, so I just went and stuck the Wendigo into the semi-cured resin, and that just kind of worked. Luckily, I have managed to save this, I think, by just sort of placing that model in there and sort of propping it up using, a bit of a tripod. It's not perfect, but it's better than having the whole diorama ruined, which definitely could have happened if I didn't realize this at all. While we wait for the resin to completely cure over the next couple of days, I'll move on to painting the sort of hunter or hiker that will be facing the Wendigo. This model is actually Joel from an earlier build that I did from The Last of Us, but I literally could not find any sort of hunters or hikers models that are holding a gun. So, I thought that Joel, this Joel model could sort of stand in for that and sort of look like a hiker that's, out in, bear country, or to be honest, I don't really know. I'm not a hunter. I'm assuming wearing bright red is not ideal for hunting, but, he could just be a hiker that's trying to be safe, bringing a gun to protect himself. After a couple of days of curing, I can remove the mold and reveal the lake section. Now, I wanted to do this before I got the Wendigo stuck into the model, but I'm going to have to do it now, which is just get a little bit of blood inside of his mouth, like he's sort of, eaten something earlier, and it's sort of still leaking out of his mouth. So I'll just mix a bit of red ink and a bit of blue into some UV cure resin, and then apply that into his mouth and on his tongues, and then cure that with the UV light. And the final step now on the Wendigo is just to spray him with a bit of clear gloss varnish to make it look like he's sort of coming out of the water and he's a bit wet. To create some ripples on the top of the lake, I'll apply down some clear gloss Mod Podge and just sort of spread that around with my brush, and then come in over the top with my air gun to sort of create some ripples. And the final step of the whole diorama is just to get the hunter or hiker secured into the base using a little toothpick that I glued to his shoe. After getting him secured on the base, the diorama is finished. I really enjoyed using some more natural materials from, around my neighborhood, and really trying to push my skills in that regard. And again, if you enjoyed the video, it'd be awesome if you could hit that subscribe button and leave a comment or like. It just really helps with the algorithm and getting the video out there. Anyway, now check out the reveal.